for this week's lecture, we are parting from the typical routine of reading a chapter out of the text or having some intensive readings. And most of the material that you're going to be going over this week come from other sources other than the text. The effects of family violence on children is one of those things that I think the text doesn't touch on as much as it might. And there's a lot of good information out here about this. And given that many of you in the social work profession are going to be working with children at one point or another in your career, or will be encountering children even if you're not in the social work profession through your work in the health industries or the education industries or wherever it might be, I believe that it's very important to understand what it is that you're looking at when you see children who are coming from violent homes, so that you may be able to intervene at an earlier stage, or enlist the engagement of persons at an earlier stage that can do something about the family violence, so that this cycle might be disrupted earlier than it would be otherwise. So in order to start this discussion, I want to step back a moment and take a look again at the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the A.C.E. study that we touched on several weeks ago in this semester, because as the slide suggests, the A.C.E. study really gives us the bigger picture of the effects of trauma. Now, if you remember, and again, I don't have the number of individuals that were involved in this particular study, but it was a very large sample of individuals who were surveyed by Kaiser Permanente, which is a healthcare organization and an organization also that runs an insurance program. And Kaiser's efforts were to try to determine what were the impacts of early childhood experiences upon those individuals who were there, who were insured by them and claiming services. So these are individuals who were, for the most part, middle class, working full-time, mostly Caucasian, and the significance of race in this is because while family violence exists in all across and the types of traumas that the A.C.E. study surveys exist across all social classes and all racial groups, it does concentrate more on the lower socioeconomic rungs of the ladder. I think we see it more frequently there, and minority races are more heavily represented in that because of the economics involved in their experience in America. And so the fact that this is largely made up of white individuals also suggests that these are really not individuals, white middle class working full time, are not individuals we generally consider to be at risk for mental health problems or behavioral problems or anything like this. And yet, when this survey was taken, it was found that the vast majority of these individuals had serious enough experiences in their life, in their early childhood experiences, to be called an adverse childhood experience, several of them, and that the more of those experiences in their childhood, the more services were being accessed through their health insurance programs. And so this really shows that that the things that happen to us in our early childhood impact us throughout our lives. It's really a very, very important study, and the study continues, and new things are found pretty consistently in this. And so I would encourage you to connect with Kaiser Permanente, or just Google the A.C.E. study and follow what goes on with that over the next several years, because you're going to see some more information come in that's really very helpful in understanding the effects of violence and other traumatic events upon our development. And so, again, the A.C.E. study showed this for a population that really isn't considered to be that much at risk, and so other populations that are at more risk are certainly going to have an even larger amount of impacts from violence and other traumas in early childhood. So this is just something to keep in mind as we go forward with this. I am certainly not an expert on brain development, and I wouldn't pretend to be. This is another area, though, that relates very closely to the whole issue of family violence and how it impacts us, especially young children. And this is another area that is well worth your attention as you work in the field over the years, to pay attention to what's going on in terms of brain research, because this is really where it's at. There is a lot of research showing, I think, that physical components of the brain, physical characteristics of the brain, may actually explain a lot of the problems that we see today that we deem to be mental health issues or whatever, might actually have some physical connections into the brain. And the whole area of research in neurobiology and neurosciences is something that I think is going to have a major impact on our field in the next generation. So pay attention to that study as well. And this is just a very simple kind of portrayal of the different sections of the brain. In the center, you see going from the least complex to the most complex. On the left-hand side, you see the kinds of functions that are controlled by the section of the brain that is to the right, more or less, of in the middle, to the right of that function. And to the left, you see just overall general kinds of characteristics of what is controlled by the different parts of the brain. And so what you want to remember is as we talk about this, the brain develops gradually. You know, there are indications now that our brain is still developing into our mid-20s. That the cortex functions, certainly with adolescents, who a lot of times we attribute adult qualities to, and most likely also to young adults now, are still developing. And so the logic center and the superego center, that self-regulation, self-control thing, isn't really fully developed until somewhere in the mid-20s, according to the latest research, is what I'm being told, at least. And so this tells us that our, and this is a bit of an aside, but that our older children continue to need parental intrusion, so to speak, into the decision making they can. And of course, once they become adults, it's difficult to do that, but that doesn't mean that you should stop trying to influence them, because they may be functioning, young adults and adolescents are functioning more in the limbic section, which, as you can see, is about emotional reactivity and sort of the id part of us, the thing that says, just go ahead and do it now and have fun. And we expect them somehow to regulate and manage themselves more as a young adult now, because legally they're an adult at 18. But their cortex, which is the thing that kind of helps them regulate, is probably not finished developing yet. And so they really still need us to kind of be their cortex, more or less. But the other piece to take from this is that in our earliest years, certainly in utero, the brainstem and the midbrain is developing, and the limbic system is there. But over time, the development of the brain in this particular chart would go from bottom to top, and we're going to talk about this more. And so what is going on, what is developing, and where the child is functioning is more in the lower sections of the brain during the young childhood, the early years in particular. Those areas around emotional reactivity and motor regulation, sleep, digestion, those kinds of things, they're not up in the problem solving and abstract thought area yet. And so this is going to be important for you to keep in mind, again, as this discussion continues. In any kind of a situation, the brain's job is, first of all, to draw the body's resources out such that survival becomes the key element whenever an individual is threatened. And that's why you get this sort of automatic fight or flight kind of response, which really takes us back to the sort of the lower functions of the brain, the physical functions, the survival functions. And so no matter how intelligent we are, no matter how well developed we may be, at times when we're threatened, the brain focuses its resources upon survival, and so we're not thinking that clearly in those situations. And so again, the brain will focus on survival first, because if we don't feel safe, we can't really function in the higher sections of the brain. And of course, most people would say this is true, at least, that the more we spend in the intellect, the higher functions of the brain, the cortex, the better off we are. The prefrontal cortex calms the rapid response system in the amygdala, which is a part of the limbic system, when threats are insignificant. The amygdala is sort of that emotional control piece in the brain, as I understand it. It's a part of the limbic system. And again, this is kind of where you see your adolescents residing most of the time in the brain, is in that emotional thing. That's why they seem to be more emotionally reactive to things than adults are sometimes, and why they don't always make good decisions under stress, because they're not really thinking logically. They're not necessarily thinking logically in the higher reaches of the brain yet, because that may not be yet fully developed. So they're still responding out of the amygdala. But the prefrontal cortex, which is a part of that higher function, that will calm that rapid response system when threats are insignificant, at least for all of us. Because of the fact that the brain is still developing in a much earlier stage with young children, they don't have a prefrontal cortex developed yet, and so they're going to react more strongly and more emotionally to violent situations. And what we're finding is that changes actually occur to the brain chemistry and to the brain structure in a way that is long lasting. In fact, perhaps everlasting when children are in chronically threatening environments. We say a lot of times we get called out in child protection on domestic violence situations, and we'll interview the children, and sometimes they can tell us, what they remember of it, and we can see that they were emotionally harmed, and can talk with parents about this. But with pre-verbal children, infants and toddlers, you can't really interview them, and so a lot of times what the workers in these investigations will do would be to look to see, are there any kind of behavioral or emotional changes? Is the child more clingy or more reactive, or has there been regression in potty training and those kinds of things? And if the child can't tell us, a lot of times we assume, especially with infants, that they're not really affected because they don't really understand. They don't really know what's going on, and so how can they be affected by it? And yet, studies will show that, in fact, they are affected very deeply by violence around them. One of the videos that you're watching this week, in fact, addresses that, and is something you don't want to miss. But in fact, this slide kind of is pulled from that video. In fact, that children are known sometimes to do things now. This would be older children are known sometimes to do things to prompt violence, just to make it more predictable for them. And it is the unpredictability and the chaos of the environment of the violent home that is particularly unsettling and disturbing to children, and to all of us who may have lived in a situation like that. Babies from violent homes have been shown to evidence what's called the frozen baby, or the inhibited baby, where they really don't connect with adults. They don't reach out. They don't respond as babies will do to human interaction. Tend to be crying a lot, have a lot of eating and sleeping problems. A lot of times when you see these kinds of things in babies, that could be a cue that the child is living in a violent home, and strongly recommend that you screen for domestic violence in those situations. So children in violent homes are forced to live in that survival area of the brain and the lower functions of the brain, and the development of the higher functions of the brain then is somewhat inhibited, and again, as one of the videos will show you, they actually say that the development kind of shut downs in the higher functions of the brain, and children learn to exist in this survival part of the brain rather constantly, including the classroom. And so instead of being able to focus upon the intellectual activities and the abstract ideas perhaps that are being shared in the classroom, the child is still kind of functioning in that survival amygdala, in that part of the brain, and so not really connecting to the lessons, and sometimes acting out behaviorally or emotionally. And again, this is a pattern that can continue for years after this episode, because of the fact that the experts are telling us that the structure of the brain and the chemistry of the brain actually changes when a child lives in a chronically violent environment. So that the kinds of behaviors that you see, the vigilance that is a part of that survival mechanism, is confused sometimes with attention deficit disorder because it looks very similar. And And a misdiagnosis with ADHD, for instance, I've seen this happen a number of times where kids are medicated for a condition that doesn't exist, and it just causes more acting out and more emotional problems, sometimes even looking kind of psychotic. And I guess if you're given the wrong medication, that's not surprising. And so this is an area, again, that is very critical to be able to diagnose and understand when you're looking at these things. The brain structure itself is changed by exposure to violence. The emotions and capacity to learn are affected, and the child becomes very keyed to nonverbal signs, so that this sort of scanning at the ready kind of way of listening to the tones of voices and reacting to that rather than the content of the communication. For instance, looking at small signs in facial expressions and body posture and those kinds of things. And so a lot of times these children may not seem to respond to things appropriately. Every new experience develops a blueprint in the brain, and particularly among those very young children, there is no conscious memory left after exposure to certain situations, whatever that situation is. Perhaps because we don't have words yet, we don't have a way of kind of forming a memory that can communicate into the years ahead. But we have this sort of this fugue when it comes to our early childhood experiences. Very few of us can remember much of anything out of the first several years of our lives, and so it may appear to the casual observer that this would mean that the things that happened back then really didn't affect us, but in fact, the foundation is being laid at that time. The building blocks for the rest of the life is being blamed in those early years when we have no conscious memory of those years. And so you can see how exposure to a violent home among infants and toddlers, unable to express and talk about it, and even perhaps to remember it, nonetheless can create changes in them that seems unexplainable and can lead to all sorts of problems later on. When you realize that how we deal with behavior problems today among children a lot of times is to take them for psychiatric intervention, and this may result in hospitalization. It often results in medication, all these kinds of things that probably aren't really appropriate, that we may be just missing what this is all about. The slide will the video will tell you that the young brain, the younger the child, the more sponge-like the brain is, and that a lot of wonderful things are going on developmentally during this period of time. Learning to walk and talk, very complicated and complex kinds of things, and also absorbing everything that's going on around it. And so therefore the younger the child, the current thinking is the more vulnerable that child is to the trauma that goes on around them. As mentioned early in this lecture, the brain develops from the bottom to the top and from the inside out, and that means the brain is structured so that the survival stuff is inside and is protected by the outer layers of the brain, and the cortex, the intellect, the thinking part of the brain, the abstract thought part of the brain is on the top and outside. And it's sort of, I've seen it like if you take a grapefruit and you lay a leaf of lettuce over the grapefruit, the leaf of lettuce is the cortex as it has developed. And so you keep that in mind, that if what happens very early in the child's life, when the inside and the bottom of the brain is developing the most, it's going to, and that causes chemical changes and reactions in the brain, is going to impact the later development of the cortex. And so the parts of the brain on the top really depend a lot upon the healthy development of the lower brain, which, as we're learning here, is deeply impacted by exposure to chronically violent homes. Kids have to learn to live in that survival brain, and so the higher brain functions actually shut down and don't develop as they would otherwise. Very young children that are exposed to violence can't articulate about that violence, but it is impacting them, and so what we see a lot of times is the stress from that manifests itself through sleep problems and anxiety, some difficulty bonding and connecting with others, being labeled in the classroom as a problem child, and having learning difficulties and acting out to kind of fulfill that label. Higher levels of mental health problems have also been found in many studies, and we touched on this earlier in the semester about emotional abuse, that more mental health problems tend to exist in children who witness violence than among those who are the victim of their own physical abuse. Babies have a tendency, like that sponge analogy, to absorb their parents' internal states. And so if a parent is constantly stressed, constantly angry and upset, the baby's brain is going to absorb that and begin to live their life in that same type of manner. And so the kind of environment the baby is exposed to really has a lot to do with the kind of person that baby becomes, whether that person is kind and good at self-regulation, or is frustrated, angry, cold, those types of things. The brain development mirrors the child's experiences. And a lot of times when we talk about spoiling babies because we're responding to them and we spend a lot of time with them and we interact with them and we cuddle them and everything, so the old way of thinking is this is spoiling a child. This is really doing what the child needs and gives that child the healthiest possibility for self-regulation as an adult. Now I want to take a moment to look at children's responses to violence in the developmental context according to each of these stages here. And this is from actually one of the web references that you're reading for this week. And this just kind of summarizes some of what's in that. Among infants, this 0 to 18 months, you see that development during this period of time is really kind of based upon, Erickson referred to it as trust versus mistrust, and it is that attachment, this basis for secure attachment as opposed to insecure attachment with the caregiver. The baby is, of course, very dependent on the caregiver for protection and nurturance. And really it is the consistency of the caregiver that gives that baby that sense of safety, and really very little capacity for dealing with stress. And so when children at this age are exposed to violence, we tend to see things that are listed here like disturbances of sleeping and eating. Remember, they can't verbalize about what's going on. They can't talk about their feelings. They can't talk to somebody to help come to some understanding. Their brain doesn't give them that capacity, and so it comes out in some of those basic functions in the lower brain functions of sleeping, eating, digestion, those kinds of things. Baby may not connect, may not be attaching to individuals, and so can't be soothed. Seem to be very irritable, cries a lot. As we get to the toddler stage of 18 months to 36 months, the child is beginning to literally get on his or her feet and move around a little bit in their increased capacities for cognitive. They begin to access and gain language, learn words, begin to communicate verbally. Their emotional range begins to expand some. The terrible twos is sort of that normal struggle for power that we're all familiar with when we've raised children, have been around little kids. And exposure to violence really disrupts the expectation that caregivers can protect, and so this again can lead to more attachment problems and more of the disruptions of eating and sleeping. Again, the child is still functioning in a fairly lower level of the brain, and what gains may have been made in terms of walking or language, toileting, those kinds of things can be lost as the child is exposed to the stress of these kinds of environments. And this terrible two sometimes can really kind of, rather than that coming through kind of normally, can go back to a very passive child that never challenges and never goes through that independence growth that the terrible twos is signaling, or to somebody, a child who just has intense struggles over independence. Now, with the children of preschoolers in this particular stage, this is the play stage that we know about, where they use play to express ideas and feelings. Of course, their cognitive and intellectual and physical capacities, language is all expanding dramatically during this period of time, in normal development at least. They can distinguish between reality and fantasy increasingly, and can have more complex relationships in their lives. But a child exposed to violence, again, a lot of times you'll see regression in developmental stages, more sleep disturbances, nightmares, generally fearful, sometimes tantruming, loyalty conflicts, don't really know who to be connected to or who they can rely upon. School-age children, healthy development in school-age children, the children begin to develop some of their own independence and really don't need the caregivers telling them what to do all the time. More increases further in language and physical and cognitive capacities, of course, more awareness of self as an individual and the environment as outside the individual. Energy a lot of times during this stage becomes focused away from the family, and with a child who's in healthy development, and the child will develop a lot of interest in activities outside the family, activities like sports, games, competitions in a healthy fashion, those kinds of things, so that a secure child really can reach outside the family and move away from some of those connections. Children who are exposed to violence, however, oftentimes have a lot of school difficulties. Of course, kids in normal homes can have school difficulties too, but we're looking at sort of some things that are red flags here, not certain kinds of pointers. But for reasons that we talked about earlier, these children have difficulty concentrating in the classroom and oftentimes perform poorly academically, often have behavioral problems, interactions with the office, those kinds of things. And you see a whole range of problem behaviors that can develop here, including separation difficulties. And sometimes you'll see with children in violent homes a high absentee pattern, and that could be because they're reluctant to leave their mother or the mother, the victim, what may keep them at home sometimes because somehow or other they're a protective mechanism, perhaps against violent behavior. Or the victim parent may actually keep the children home for soothing and those kinds of things, and so, or they're just afraid to leave their parent because they're afraid of what might happen while they're gone. They may see themselves in a protective role, and so sometimes school attendance problem is also another thing you'll see sometimes. Finally, among adolescents, typical development with a healthy adolescent, there's a lot of preoccupation about bodily growth. Sex is the focus of a lot of the thinking and feeling of the adolescent for a number of years, as those whole things emerge in ways that never known before to the individual, as well as some increased urges and aggressive urges, as well as I think as hormones kind of become more active in the body and those kinds of things. Independence is sort of the key here, that during the adolescent years, that is the process whereby the child, dependent upon the parent, moves away from that parent and wants to establish his own independent identity. And so a lot of times you'll see some struggles around whether or not they can go out and what their curfew hour is and whether they have to tell their parents what they're doing and those kinds of things. Heavily influenced by peer pressure, focus on developing an identity as an individual, and sometimes other developmental issues come up also in a normal adolescent that has to be kind of resolved once again. For adolescents that are exposed to violent homes, these things, these tendencies, these normal tendencies perhaps become exaggerated. So there's an over-focus upon development of the body, maybe unsafe sex, drugs and alcohol, running away, acting out behaviors, and not just a struggle for independence sometimes with adults, but really serious difficulties in relationship with the parents. Some confusion about identity, in its worst form sometimes dating violence as a victim or an aggressor, if depending upon if the child is attached and associated with the victim or the aggressor in the battering in the home. And on the other side of that, sometimes adolescents that have grown up in a violent home become very timid and really want to avoid the whole adolescent experience, and so they sort of function as a younger child much longer than they should. And so you can see here through the range of these 5 stages here that each stage has some signs and symptoms that may help you identify kids that are living in violent homes if you don't know this otherwise. Another thing that you might be able to do with this material when talking with the victim and helping, and I'll say her because typically it is her, helping her to make the decision to get out of that environment and protect the child from this violent home. You can help the victim understand the kinds of things that they see with their child, and compare that to children who are growing up in environments that are more predictable and normal, and that may motivate the victim to take some steps necessary, and for that matter, even sometimes the batterers can learn from this as well. So this is that concludes the first part of this week's lecture. After you take a break, come back and we'll pick up the second part of the lecture, which is going to look at kind of how to respond and the signs and symptoms, so to speak, and how to respond when you see those signs and symptoms, as well as we're going to take a look a little bit at batterers again and their role in all of this.